The city always felt different after midnight. Its usual hum of activity faded into a muted lull, as though the buildings themselves were holding their breath. Detective Marcus Thorne adjusted the collar of his trench coat against the crisp air, his shoes clicking softly against the damp pavement. The streetlights buzzed faintly above, casting uneven pools of yellow light that seemed to retreat from the darkness rather than pierce it. He hadn't planned to be here tonight. His shift had ended hours ago, but sleep was an elusive stranger these days. The nagging pull of insomnia drove him to the quieter parts of the city, where he could walk and think without interruption. Or at least, that was the excuse he gave himself. The truth was harder to confront. Marcus was running. From what? He wasn't sure. Maybe the memories he worked so hard to bury, or the ghost of his estranged father who still haunted his thoughts. The alley was an afterthought. He turned into it instinctively, drawn by the sound of something, a faint shuffle, like footsteps dragging across wet asphalt. At first he saw nothing but a row of overflowing dumpsters and crumbling brick walls. Then his gaze landed on the ground. A playing card. It rested at the center of the alley, pristine and out of place, its edges crisp despite the grime and rain. Marcus crouched, his brow furrowing as he picked it up. It was a king of diamonds, the face vibrant and unnerving in its clarity. He turned the card over, half expecting a note or a stain, but the back was spotless, a geometric red and white pattern gleaming faintly in the light. Something about it sent a shiver down his spine, though he couldn't say why. That's when he noticed the silence. The distant hum of the city, cars rumbling, muffled conversations, the occasional bark of a stray dog, had disappeared entirely. The air was thick now, heavy with an unnatural stillness that pressed against his chest. Marcus rose to his feet, his hand tightening around the card. A faint sound echoed behind him, breaking the silence. A rustling, almost imperceptible, as if something unseen shifted in the shadows. He turned sharply, scanning the alley, but it was empty. No footprints in the puddles, no sign of movement. For a long moment he stood frozen, the card's edges biting into his palm. Then, as quickly as it had come, the feeling passed. The sounds of the city returned in a slow wave, distant but familiar. Marcus slipped the card into his pocket, his heart pounding. He didn't know what it meant yet, but it didn't feel random. As he left the alley, a single thought lingered in his mind. Was it a message or a warning? The King of Diamonds wasn't the only one. 3 days later, Marcus sat in his dimly lit office, staring at a collection of playing cards scattered across his desk. An ace of spades, found in a locked warehouse with no trace of its owner. A queen of clubs, discovered in a public park where a jogger had left their running shoes and vanished into thin air. The cards were his only leads, left behind like breadcrumbs. The media hadn't caught wind of it yet. Missing persons weren't uncommon in a city like this, and most cases were quickly resolved. But these weren't ordinary disappearances. No signs of struggle, no witnesses, no clues except for the cards. And they all shared one chilling detail. Each location was pristine, untouched, as though the person had simply ceased to exist. Marcus ran a hand through his hair, his eyes scanning the reports. It was late, and the fluorescent light above flickered intermittently, casting restless shadows across the room. He hadn't told anyone about the case yet. Not his partner, not his superiors. Part of him didn't want to share it, as though speaking it aloud would make it real. He reached for his notebook, flipping to the page where he'd scribbled his observations. The cards weren't random, that much he was sure of. Their placement seemed deliberate, like pieces of a puzzle waiting to be assembled. But the meaning eluded him, each connection slipping through his fingers like smoke. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he called, his voice rough from hours of silence. The door creaked open, revealing Angela Pierce, a journalist he'd worked with on and off over the years. Her sharp eyes missed nothing, and tonight they were fixed on the cards scattered across his desk. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, stepping inside. "Not yet," Marcus muttered, shuffling the cards into a neat pile. Angela frowned, leaning closer. They're from the old Marquez case, aren't they?" Marcus froze. "What do you know about Marquez?" She hesitated, then pulled out her phone. A few taps, and she handed it to him. The screen displayed a grainy photo of a playing card, a jack of hearts, half buried in snow outside a derelict apartment. Beneath it was a headline, "Marquez disappearance linked to strange card phenomenon." "That case went cold 10 years ago," Angela said quietly. 6 people vanished in as many weeks, each with a card left behind. It never made sense, and then it just stopped. Until now. The weight of her words settled over Marcus like a shroud. He leaned back in his chair, the edges of the cards pressing into his palms. "You think this is connected," he said, though it wasn't a question. Angela nodded. "I think you've stumbled into something much bigger than you realize." For the first time in years, Marcus felt the cold fingers of fear creeping up his spine. What game had he walked into, and how could he ever hope to win? The library smelled of old paper and varnish, a strangely comforting scent that reminded Marcus of simpler times, days before his career consumed him, before his life unraveled into sleepless nights and restless guilt. The soft glow of antique lamps illuminated shelves packed with leather-bound tomes, their spines faded with age. It was the kind of place that felt untouched by time, though tonight it carried an undercurrent of unease that prickled Marcus's skin. He stood at a wooden table near the back, flipping through a worn book titled Symbolism in Playing Cards. Across from him sat Professor Eleanor Greaves, a retired historian with a reputation for dabbling in the arcane. She was a sharp, wiry woman with piercing eyes that seemed to see through people. "The cards are part of something ancient," she began, her voice low but steady. "Something older than the game of poker or tarot readings. They've been used for centuries as more than just entertainment. They're a language, a tool for manipulating fate." Marcus frowned, holding up the Queen of Clubs. "Manipulating fate? You're saying these cards mean something beyond their face value?" Greaves nodded, folding her hands neatly on the table. "In certain traditions, yes. Each suit represents an element. Hearts for water, diamonds for fire, clubs for earth, spades for air. The face cards, especially the royals, carry greater significance, symbols of power, strategy, and control. But it's the placement of the cards that matters most. Where they're left, how they're arranged. It's a message." "A message," Marcus echoed, glancing at the cards on the table. Their pristine surfaces gleamed under the warm light, their presence unsettling in a way he couldn't quite articulate. "Have you noticed the pattern yet?" she asked. Marcus hesitated. He'd been so focused on finding the next card that he hadn't stopped to consider their arrangement as a whole. He spread them out, ordering them chronologically. The King of Diamonds, the Queen of Clubs, the Ace of Spades. "They're moving inward," Greaves murmured, leaning closer. Her finger hovered over the map pinned to the table, tracing the locations where the cards had been found. "Each one is placed closer to the city's center." Marcus's stomach tightened. "You think whoever, or whatever, is behind this is leading us somewhere?" "Perhaps," she said. "But the question is, why? What's waiting at the end?" The room fell into a heavy silence. Marcus felt the weight of the cards pressing down on him, as though they were demanding something he couldn't yet give. "What about the Joker?" he asked suddenly. Greaves's expression darkened. "The Joker is unpredictable. A wild card, yes, but also a disruptor of order. It can signal chaos, or something far worse. Before Marcus could press her further, the librarian approached, his footsteps unusually loud against the polished floor. He handed Marcus a small envelope, his expression unreadable. "This was left at the front desk for you," the librarian said quietly before retreating into the shadows. Marcus opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a single playing card, a joker, its grinning face frozen in a grotesque smile. Scrawled across its surface in jagged handwriting were 2 words: "Keep playing." The card felt heavier than it should, as though the inked threat carried a physical weight. Marcus stared at it, his mind racing. Greaves leaned forward, her brow furrowed as she examined the joker. "It's an invitation," she said, her voice tinged with apprehension. "But also a warning. Someone wants you to follow the trail, Marcus, and they don't want you to stop." Marcus tucked the card into his coat pocket, ignoring the unease that churned in his gut. "If this is a game, then I need to know the rules. Otherwise, I'm walking blind." Greaves hesitated, her fingers brushing the edges of an ancient book. "There are no rules," she said finally. "Not for you. The cards aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to ensnare. Whoever's behind this knows how to manipulate perception, how to blur the line between chance and control. If you're not careful, you'll lose yourself to the game." Her words lingered in Marcus's mind as he left the library and stepped into the night. The air was sharp, each breath burning in his chest. The city around him was unusually quiet, its usual hum muffled as though the world itself was holding its breath. As he walked toward his car, the sensation of being watched crept over him. He glanced back, but the street was empty. Still, the shadows seemed to move at the edges of his vision, shapes shifting just out of reach. When he reached his apartment, he locked the door behind him and tossed the joker onto his desk. The cards stared back at him, their silent presence demanding his attention. He tried to focus on the case, piecing together clues, but his thoughts kept circling back to the joker's message. Keep playing. Sleep didn't come easily that night. His dreams were fragmented and disjointed. Images of endless corridors, of figures with blurred faces holding cards that burned like embers. In the background, he heard whispers, faint and unintelligible, growing louder as he ran toward a door that never seemed to get closer. He woke in a cold sweat, his heart racing. The room was dark, but something felt wrong. The cards were no longer on his desk. They were spread out on the floor in a perfect spiral, the joker resting at the center. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't touched them. A low hum filled the room, a vibration he could feel in his bones. It wasn't coming from outside. It was emanating from the cards themselves. "Who's there?" he called, his voice steady despite the fear curling in his chest. No answer, just the hum, growing louder, more insistent. Marcus knelt and picked up the joker, his hands trembling. Written beneath the original message was something new. Your move. For the first time in years, Marcus felt truly alone. Whatever this game was, it had already begun, and the cards were waiting for him to play. The air in Marcus's apartment had grown stifling, thick with a presence he couldn't see but could feel, an oppressive force pressing in from all sides. The cards remained in their spiral formation on the floor, an unspoken challenge radiating from their perfect alignment. The joker sat at the center, its grotesque grin mocking him in the dim light. Marcus sank into his chair, his pulse hammering in his ears. For the first time in years, he felt like a child again, alone in the dark and afraid to look under the bed. The weight of the joker's message echoed in his mind. Your move. He reached for the card, his fingers hesitant. As soon as he touched it, the hum that had filled the room vanished, replaced by an unnerving silence. Then slowly a faint sound emerged. A shuffle, soft and rhythmic, as if someone were rifling through a deck of cards. It was coming from the hallway. Marcus turned toward the sound, his breath catching. The shadows just beyond his door seemed to thicken, pooling like ink. He knew he was being watched. "Who are you?" he called, his voice strained but steady. The shuffling stopped. The silence that followed was so profound it felt alive, as though the air itself had paused to listen. And then, faintly, came a whisper. "Play the game." The voice was neither male nor female, its tone both soothing and sinister, laced with a strange familiarity that sent chills racing down Marcus's spine. "What game?" he demanded, rising to his feet. The whisper returned, closer this time. "You already know." The lights flickered, plunging the room into brief, suffocating darkness before returning with a dim, sickly glow. Marcus's eyes darted back to the spiral of cards. They had rearranged themselves. The Joker was still at the center, but the others now formed a jagged path leading to the window. His heart pounding, Marcus approached the window cautiously. The city stretched out before him, its streets eerily empty. But in the distance, one building stood out, a high-rise bathed in a strange, otherworldly light that pulsed faintly in rhythm with his racing heart. He knew instinctively that this was where the trail led. The high-rise was a skeleton of steel and glass, abandoned long before Marcus had joined the force. Its construction had halted due to funding issues, but rumors swirled about other reasons, whispers of accidents and unexplained disappearances that had plagued the site. Now standing at its base, Marcus felt its presence like a living thing. The light he'd seen from his window was gone, but the air around the building crackled faintly, as if charged with invisible energy. The entrance was unlocked, the heavy door creaking ominously as he pushed it open. Inside, the silence was absolute, broken only by the echo of his footsteps on the concrete floor. The cards were waiting for him. They formed a path through the empty lobby, leading to a staircase that spiraled upward into darkness. Marcus followed, each step slower than the last, his breath visible in the unnatural cold that gripped the air. On the 13th floor, the path ended. The cards formed a perfect circle at the center of the room, their faces gleaming in the faint moonlight streaming through shattered windows. At the center of the circle sat the Joker, its grin more menacing than ever. Marcus knelt, his fingers brushing the card. As he did, the room seemed to shift, the walls warping subtly, their edges bleeding into shadow. "You've come far," the voice whispered, surrounding him now, filling the room like a cold wind. "But every game has its cost." The Joker's face seemed to change, its features twisting into something unrecognizable, sharper, crueler. The cards around it began to move, shuffling and spinning, their motion blurring into a vortex of color. "What do you want?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The answer came not in words, but in a vision. Images flooded his mind, faces of the missing, their expressions frozen in silent pleas. The King of Diamonds, the Queen of Clubs, the Ace of Spades, all forming an intricate pattern that stretched back decades. And then, finally, his own face, staring back at him from within the cards. "You were always part of the game," the voice said, a note of finality in its tone. "But now, you must decide. Will you play, or will you fall?" The spinning card slowed, revealing two paths, one leading to light, the other to shadow. Marcus's heart pounded as he reached for the Joker, his mind racing. He didn't know what lay at the end of either path, but he understood one thing. The game wasn't about winning. It was about choosing. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and placed the Joker in the path of light. The cards dissolved into nothingness, the oppressive air lifting. When Marcus opened his eyes, the room was empty, the chill replaced by warmth. But as he turned to leave, he felt it, the faint hum of unseen eyes still watching, the Joker's grin lingering at the edge of his mind. The game wasn't over. It had only just begun.